Welcome to Hands-On for CAST 2020. It's a warm-up session before CAST 2022. So we are doing this because we are having a cast on November 7th and 8th in Santiago. We would love to see you over there. I've shared you the code of conduct because we all from different diverse background and different region. So we would appreciate if you can maintain that code of conduct. Today we are going to have first Louise Perold. She is going to talk about building quality connection in the remote world. Second, we have James Thomas, who is going to talk about random exploration on Chatbot API. We, as Association for Software Testing, is again inviting you to join CAST 2022 on November 7th and 8th. It's in San Diego. There's a link which is mentioned in the screen. You can just click on that. You can just use that link and book your ticket. We would love to see you on CAST. We have these amazing speakers who are coming and sharing their experience on hands-on. And I encourage you to listen to them, and whatever they are conveying it to you, you would just immediately after listening to them, you can implement in your work. And I hope it will be really helpful to you. Being a member from like Association of Software Testing, you would get an opportunity to be included on several things which are displayed on the screen, such as you will get a conference discount, or you would be included in DVST class, or you will able to help as a volunteer with our initiatives. There are many much more things. I encourage you to join us as our membership program. Pay with what you can, and we would love to see you as a member. There are several PBST courses which are happening, such as Foundation Community Track, Test Design Community Track, Advocacy Community Track, and Instructor. And if you take any of this course, I definitely believe that you will be able to sharpen your skill and implement in your day-to-day work, and it would be really helpful for you. So now, without delaying it, I'm passing it to Louise.
Thanks, Trisha. Let me share my screen. Okay, can everyone see my screen? I think so. Okay. All right, so my name is Louise, and I'm currently a quality area lead at a company called OutSystems. I'm also the secretary on the board at AST, where I've been a member since around 2007. And I'd like to share with you today my experiences working remotely in a new job and a new country over the last couple of years. And I hope there's some things that you find relatable. And I'd really like to hear from you and share any learnings more deeply later on if you're keen for that. So here's my Twitter and my email in case you want to get in touch later. I found a lot of inspiration and learning being part of AST. So a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about and that I've been experimenting with have their foundation ideas from people that I've met or heard about through AST. So it's yet another good reason to come to CAST. My first testing job was in 2001. So I guess you could call me old school, very old school. And maybe that's part of why I found myself really, really struggling when I arrived in Portugal to start a new job in Feb 2020. And 1 month later, we went completely remote because of COVID, and everyone's world had changed. And I used to rely really heavily on all the finely tuned observing senses of a tester I'd honed over the years. So eavesdropping on conversations and listening acutely to things and asking curious questions over coffee and breaks, seeing things on whiteboards as I walked past and having an opportunity to talk to people about them. And all of that was suddenly gone. And the first year and a bit more than a year, really, I just felt like I was kind of muddling my way through the dark, like giving status updates to people that I felt like I didn't really know. They didn't really know anything about me, what I was trying to do, what my experience was, where I was coming from, and it brought out a lot of insecurities. But there were these two sort of bright stars, and well, the biggest bright star was the rest of the quality group that I was working with at Art Systems. So they already had a sync set up, a practice sync, and it was weekly, but sometimes it got skipped and sometimes it didn't really have an agenda. So I just suggested that we use the space really as a more formal place for us to share. And I used an old heuristic that I'd previously used with teams. So talking about each person, talking about their achievements and learnings, the things that got in the way, anything that they felt like the rest of the group should know, and how they were feeling. And that became a glue, really, and a way to get to know the rest of the quality group better, get to know their ideas, their work, get inspiration. So that really helped. The other cool bright spark was because my role had a focus on end-to-end testing, I could start really advocating for and implementing a weekly ensemble session. So I just kept the cadence of once a week, started really with the quality group, and we could be kind of prepared, less prepared or more prepared, but we would always be able to find something that we could learn or test together. And then as it got a bit more traction, we would add specific initiatives that we wanted to test or have slightly more formal sessions. I created conference pages and templates just to help people to understand the process. And every time we had one of these sessions, I would just kind of repeat the mechanics and explain to people what we were trying to achieve. And it's kind of slowly gained a life of its own within Art Systems. Different people have started facilitating their own sessions in their own groups. And yeah, it's kind of become a thing. And not every session initially was always awesome in terms of the bugs that we found, or occasionally we would miss some things as well, and that was okay. But we just kept the purpose of learning at the forefront of it. And as I say, it's kind of grown legs. And this is just an example of like the mind map that we might use to plan, and some of our charter, and then the issues that we found, our observations, and then the team can go and log bugs from that. Around October 2020, we started working with an adaptation of SAFE and started having quarterly planning and innovation with 2-week sprints in between. So I'm going to use the words PI a lot from now on. PI just stands for product increment, and it's basically just a quarter. Then around August 2021, I became the quality area lead for the platform teams. So here I finally felt a bit like it's my place to try some things that have worked for me in the past and maybe could again, but I would need to just adapt them to a remote context. So the first thing that was really important for me was we were working, 4 of us, quality engineers, with 7, at the time 7 teams became 8, 9 teams, but all working in the same code base and in the same context. So it was really important for me that we become kind of a well-oiled machine and that we really start to understand the teams better. So first was us. Hi. And I focused on us having a daily sync. So just like a stand-up, basically, where we can kind of talk to each other, get to know each other better, have a quick rant, share any questions, get unblocked with things. And then a second meeting was an area weekly sync that we have with each other, which is a bit longer. So this allows us just to step back a little bit. We take notes at this meeting, and that helps us to also at the end of a quarter go back through all those notes, and we can kind of reflect then on what were all the achievements that we had through through the quarter, what friction did we have, what stuff got in the way. So it's really helpful actually also for reviews at the end of any quarter. And then of course, one-on-ones with the team to make sure that I understand and get to know them on a deeper level. And then we also attend some team daily stand-ups, so the teams that we're working with on a day-to-day basis. As I say, at the end of this first kind of product increment, we had a retrospective. And this is sort of, again, an opportunity that I felt like we could use to really think about what was the stuff that we really enjoyed as a quality group, as a quality team within this bigger group, what things got in the way in terms of our strategies and what we were trying to achieve. And bubbling up from that came a whole bunch of ideas. And we could then add those ideas into our backlog for the following product increment. I don't know what's going on. Yeah, sorry. Okay. Where am I? Right. Then we had our next second retrospective. So in this one, what we realized is that we didn't have, or we wanted to further develop the relationship that we had with each of the team leads. So we decided to have a once a sprint sync with each team lead. And this is kind of the format here. So each team lead has like a little section on this Miro board and an opportunity to add things to the agenda for their specific meeting. We share a little bit of the metrics. We have some common agenda items or themes of things that we're trying to advocate for or push with the teams. And then we can also get feedback as well from them on an individual basis. Yeah, that's also been working pretty well. And then at the third retrospective, something we learned was that we were actually doing a lot of work that was a little bit external to the teams. It was for the group, so things on like CI pipelines, that kind of stuff, but it maybe wasn't immediately obvious to them that we were doing these things. So we decided to have actually like a sprint review that we have once every sprint, and we kind of demo a couple of things. We talk to the things that we've achieved. Again, we focus on metrics maybe that we want to highlight, and then talk a little bit about what we're planning to do next. So we can get feedback on those priorities and understand if those are things that are indeed concerns, and are we missing anything in terms of those next items that we want to tackle. And along the way, as a quality practice, we also implemented a few more syncs at the practice level. So one was knowledge sharing across the practice, which happens every 2 weeks, and anyone can add an item to the agenda on something that they want to share. And also once a quarter, we have a whole practice get together. Those of us that are in Lisbon can all go into the office and actually just be in the same room together, which is really cool. But we have some people remote as well, so we have a hybrid kind of session there. And we also try to encourage some external connections, so things like Frogs Conf, AST webinars, and Lean Coffees are also things that we encourage everybody to try to attend to get some external ideas and feedback. Some things that didn't work so well, I tried to have a Zoom lunch. But lunch is a very important thing in Portugal, and people take it very seriously, and so they like to get away from their screen. So it didn't really gain much traction. Social hangouts also haven't really worked, but book club works very well. So we still have a book club, which is cool. So hello. Okay, what have I learned? I got a lot more confidence through connecting, and getting to know the humans brings me joy, which is great. and I think I also got a much better feeling for what's actually happening with people and teams. I was able to get more closer to the detail of the things that getting in the way of quality, and it helped me just to gain confidence in the things that we're prioritizing and doing. And just these different kinds of meetings with different focuses and perspective allowed me to observe different things, right, in terms of what's going on in the space. Some practical tips, I guess. If you continually retrospect, it helps to spark new ideas and has helped us to refine some of the old ones. Having containers, so just regular times in the calendar, for me really work. So just sticking to it, starting the habits, having the habits has really worked. And I've also realized that not everything needs a meeting, because perhaps I wasn't always tending towards, okay, let's just have a meeting and we can talk about it. So I do need to catch myself when I'm doing that and it's not needed. Changing it up. We've tried to make slight tweaks to these things as time has passed and as we retrospect, which is helpful. I've also learned that I need to choose when I should be facilitating and when I just need to share something and doesn't actually require a facilitated discussion. And having agendas and things in Miro, talking to something, it actually also helps you to reduce admin, because I tend to just be able to take a screenshot of the Miro board, send it out to everybody afterwards, just with a link to the recording and some notes, and that's kind of the minutes of the meeting there, which is really useful. And that's it for me. And I'm open to have some questions or thoughts or anything.
Thank you, Louise, for sharing. That was really insightful. I would appreciate people to raise their hand or type the questions in the chat. Those who don't want to raise their hand, and we go through the circle.
I see Chris had a question. How do you decide when it's time to facilitate and when it's time to share? Yeah, I guess it's a difficult one and probably very contextual. But when I'm just trying to do a more status updates, review, demo, those sorts of meetings, I just tend to be, here we're going to share, and at the end I'll open for questions or feedback. The facilitation, I would say, mostly comes in with the retrospectives, 5 whys types of sessions, which I didn't actually speak about, but we also do those. The more brainstorming kind of things. I think that's also, sometimes I was also tending to want to get more input from people and trying to facilitate, trying to control that, which, yeah, that's where I just need to go. No, it's okay. Hilary.
Yes, can you hear me, Lou?
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. First of all, apologies. I think it was me doing the whole feedback stuff because I just unmuted myself. So terribly sorry for that.
No worries.
So just a little question. During the Corona times, we all had a lot of video conferencing, and Zoom was on almost all the time. And there was something like a Zoom fatigue kicking in, especially kind of feeling incredibly observed by the camera. So I certainly felt that. Did you have any? But then again, it was also quite annoying if you spoke to a crowd and no one had the camera on, so you spoke to a wall of icons. Did you have any sort of policy in terms of camera usage during the video calls?
No, but I think it's quite interesting because the longer we've gone on with COVID, the more actually people are just tending towards always having their cameras on, or certainly in art systems. And I don't know if that's also maybe just an art systems thing now.
I think people just gave up. It's kind of,
Yeah. Well, it's just also like, yeah, it's like, okay, if I never turn my camera on, I'm never gonna have anybody see my face ever. So maybe I should just turn it on because. But yeah, I think it also depends on the kind of meeting, right? Like if it's a status update, I'm not too worried if people don't turn the cameras on. But when you're trying to like I think within my team, I really try to focus on it should be a safe space where we all feel, okay. And if somebody doesn't want to, that's okay too. Like I'm not stressed about it, but I want it to just be cool and fun for us to have our cameras and have banter and do all those things. James.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, cheers, Lou. Thank you for the talk. I was interested to know why you think the social meets didn't work.
That's a good question. I mean, I think it could also be the timing that we were doing it and people's just fatigue, like Ilari was saying, just the general, like, okay, at 6:37, I just need to get off my computer. And perhaps, yeah, with maybe, I don't know, if we had tried it at like during much more, because we were trying it on a Friday afternoon at like 6 p.m, which I think is probably just not really a thing. I mean, it's a good time to be social, but not a good time to be social on Zoom. Everyone just wants to go and have a drink or something.
Yeah, we experienced something similar at my work where forced social time, a scheduled social doesn't feel quite right.
Yeah, it does feel a bit like contrived, or I don't know, it's weird.
We have more question from the chat. Twin is asking, how do you handle individuals that aren't as participative in those meetings, or continuously say that they are working and won't be able to make the meeting?
So again, I guess it depends a bit on the type of meeting. On the status update, those kinds of things, I record them, and if people aren't able to attend, it's cool because they can just watch the recording later. It's not a big deal. When it comes to the retros and the team meetings that we have, I have an amazing team. I don't actually have this problem. So yeah. I don't really know how I would handle that specifically. I think, again, I would say I want to try and encourage a situation where the team feel like they can prioritize the testing meetings that we have and the meetings that we have as a quality group. And that for me should be, one of the top most important things. And if we need to reschedule or change something, that's okay too, but then we should just talk.
We have a question from Sandy Kaolas, and she is asking, any tips on new observation techniques or indicators in remote situation?
Yeah, it's really hard because also sometimes you make assumptions, just like with Slack, I think, about people's Zoom demeanor, and it's maybe not. And then you meet them in person sometimes and you're like, whoa, okay, this is completely not what I was kind of observing. So I think you have to be really careful not to try and not bias based on what you're immediately seeing. I think I try to really maybe just even unbias myself further in terms of what I'm seeing, if that makes sense.
We have a question from Chika. How will you say helped to build your confidence over time?
I think just getting to know people better. It's you maybe feel a bit more heard and a bit more understood, and that helps you feel a bit more confident, I think. Yeah.
I think we have completed all the questions from you, Louise. Thank you. Thanks. It was really insightful to get about remote meetings and different perspective. Thank you. Now I would like to invite James. James, please share your thoughts.
Yep, thank you. Let me just share the screen. Okay, hopefully you can see my slides.
Yeah, it's not in the slideshow. Yeah, now it's
Okay,
good.
great. Okay, so thank you all for coming. I am James Thomas, Vice President at AST, and I haven't been a member quite as long as Lou. I've only been a member since about 2011, so she wins on that score. Today I'm going to talk about some tooling that I wrote to help me explore a new piece of API that we built at work. And work for me is AIDA Health. I'm a tester at AIDA, and AIDA build a symptom checking application. And when I say symptom checker, you may be familiar with something like Babylon or WebMD, or maybe the NHS 111 app if you're in the UK. Essentially, what they're doing is taking some personal information and then asking for your symptoms today. So something that you think is, you know, you're not feeling well, or something, you got a headache or something like that. You're then guided through a series of questions which are designed to get some idea of conditions that you might have, things that might be wrong with you. And the AIDA app, the kind of set of questions, it's usually around 20 questions, and then as you can see down at the bottom right here, there'll be a list of suggestions and also a piece of advice, like in this case it's go to the emergency department without delay, but it might be going to the pharmacist, or it might be just treat yourself at home. We call this an assessment, and there are essentially two different versions of the product. There's a consumer version which runs on mobile, and then there's a business-to-business version which is typically web-based. So the architecture of the system at a very abstract level is the kind of thing that you might expect. We have the clients talking to a back-end service, and behind the service there's a reasoning engine which knows a great deal about the medical domain, and the reasoning engine is the thing that chooses what question to ask next, and at the end of the assessment it gives the list of suggested conditions. So I joined a project that had started, I don't know, a month or so earlier, to extract a kind of basic chatbot API from the existing API provided by that service. And what I didn't say, but is important, is that the client and the service in our main product are reasonably tightly coupled. So the service knows things about the client. In particular, it knows about the gadgets that the client has to be able to present things to the user. So it knows that there are buttons, for example. It knows that images can be presented in a certain way. And what we wanted to do was provide a presentation agnostic API, something that didn't know about the clients. It wasn't tightly coupled to the clients. And the idea there was that we could integrate with something as simple as a really basic text clients, something like WhatsApp, for example, where the service wouldn't need to care so much about the capability of the client. But it needed to remain still a turn-based medical assessment, where the service would say, tell me this, and the client would say, okay, is the answer. Then the service would say, tell me this, and the client would say, okay, there's the answer. And because this is the real world, of course, there was also a short deadline for building this new service. This is the architecture that we were going to build. Again, this was decided before I joined. And you can see that the existing architecture stays, and what we're doing is abstracting out, essentially abstracting out a proportion of the existing API so that new text-based clients can talk to that. No doubt, meeting full of testers, you're already thinking about potential risks. You've got questions, and you've probably got test ideas too. What I'm going to focus on today is one particular risk that I identified along with Sunita, the other tester on the team, and that is, how are we going to cover the assessment space? What do I mean by that? Well, what you're looking at is a kind of model of the assessment space, and those blobs, they're one path. That's one possible assessment out of all the possible assessments that there could be. And there are very many possible assessments. So, for example, the user could have many birthdays. They could be in many parts of the world. They could have many different symptoms. They could have those symptoms to different degrees for different lengths of time and so on. They could have different questions asked of them in different orders, and their answers could have different attributes too. The combinatorial explosion is really true in this space. And what did we think the kind of risks here were? Well, risks of unintended consequences. Let's say we find there's a problem on some of the paths through this space, and we put a fix in. How are we going to have any confidence at all that we haven't introduced a side effect somewhere else in that vast space? You can't manually test all of those things. How are we going to give ourselves some idea of what's going on outside of the path that we just fixed? How could we proactively look for those places, the kind of edge cases and the corner cases somewhere in that space where operations that have been fine everywhere that we've looked at them suddenly stop being fine, that you can get the system into a state where going to the next question doesn't work, for example? And how are we going to exercise this API extensively before the deadline? The existing API, I mean, AIDA's been going for about 10 years or something. The existing API has probably had millions of assessments through it. This new API, we just wouldn't have the chance to exercise it like that as people. So what could we do to give ourselves the opportunity to exercise it too? And the suggestion that I came up with was a walker. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's something that could, unattended, run medical assessments from end to end. I wanted something that could be iterated and customized, and I wanted to be able to do that quickly because I wanted to use the walker to find data for me or to answer questions for me. Each time I had a question, something I wanted to test, I wanted to be able to ask the walker to go and look for data that would help me to answer that question. And also, just while it was walking these assessments, I wanted it to maybe note that there was a place that it might be interesting for a human to go and look. And it could achieve this by randomly answering questions in the assessment. So instead of following kind of predetermined paths, it would just choose random answers. And that's what this looked like. The kind of simplest thing I could think of that could possibly implement a walker looked like this. Over on the left-hand side, assessments would start. And then the walker would say, okay, what's the card type? And what do I mean by card type? What I mean is, what kind of dialogue turn is this? The internal name for that was card. So is it a text type? Essentially, a text type is something that the server wants the client to present to the user. So like, welcome to AIDA. Well, you know, the client doesn't need to do much there, just say, okay. An input type, the server's asking for some information. So what's your name? What's your age? What symptoms are you going to search for? And the walker could just choose random strings or random numbers when it encounters those. And what about choices? Often the server will say this, that, or the other. And again, really easy for the walker just to choose a random answer and then submit that back to the server. And if the server wants to ask another question, we'll go around that loop. And if it doesn't, we're at the end of the assessment and we're done. So that was what I proposed. And in fact, that's exactly what I implemented. And while I was building this thing, I noticed there were sort of 3 different kinds of activities that I was doing that were mashing up kind of development and testing work. And the boundaries between them are pretty grey, but I think these are interesting points in that kind of spectrum. So the first activity was navigation. And while I was navigating, I just wanted to build something that would go from the start to the end. I was prepared to make compromises, use workarounds, anything at all that would just allow me to go from the beginning to the end. And so, for example, that's more of a sort of developer mindset, if you like. But all the while I was doing that, I was getting ideas for things that I might want to test. So, for example, why can't I follow this path? Why do these two payloads look very similar, but I'm forced to write two different parsing routines for them? Why can't they be the same? Why am I having to make that effort? Why is this endpoint a get and this endpoint's a post? And because I was building this at the same time as the team was building the service itself, I could feed that back into development. And then I could test the things that we'd changed as well. A kind of second mode of operation was I've kind of built that end-to-end thing, that sort of walking skeleton, if you like. Now I want to broaden it out. Anywhere I've made a compromise, I want to undo the compromise. So, for example, in the first version of this, I only ever did assessments for female users, just because that was straightforward at the time I was building it. But in this phase, I broadened that out to increase the coverage of the tool, to make it a random choice for sex. I also started to make assertions. So I would assert at every dialogue step that the schema of the server's response was what was expected. I also started to make assertions for error behavior. As we kind of worked out how the system should error, I would make requests that I thought would force the server to error and then check that it did. And I also started to make speculative assertions. If I thought that some property of the system should be true at every dialogue step, I would just assert it. And then over time, over multiple runs, if the assertion failed, I'd know that either my hypothesis was wrong, or I'd coded it wrong in the walker, or the system wasn't as consistent as we thought it should be. And each of those is a kind of interesting testing question. And the third kind of activity that mixes development and testing is exploration. And in this one, it's much more biased towards testing. At the navigation end, I'm building, and that's generating questions for me, things I might want to look at. At the exploration end, I've got the code, and now I'm coming with questions, and I'm wondering, how can I do things with the code to help me answer those questions? What kind of questions might I like to answer? Well, here's one. What's the longest assessment there could possibly be, and how would the system behave when things get really long? And I kind of looked into that, and it was really interesting, but I'll come back to it. Let me quickly show you a demo of the system running. So what you're looking at, you'll see it's a command line tool. It runs, as you saw, just kind of kick it off at the command line. The word test that you saw there is the log file that's going to be produced. Dialogue turns are numbered. This is the walker counting the turns that it's done. You can see the card type here is text, so that's just presentation. Card type here is choice. Anything with an arrow to the left is the server asking. Anything with an arrow to the right is the walker responding. So here there was a choice of an assessment for yourself or for someone else, and it just randomly chose myself. Here's an input, what's your name? And here's a random string. This is the name of the user for this run. And here's another choice card. Let me just let it run on. And you'll see that after a few turns, a kind of onboarding, if you like, what are your symptoms? Tell me something about yourself. Now we're into lots of questions about the problems and the feelings that the user has now. This one's actually quite a short assessment, about 40 turns. And as we get to the end, you'll see that there we go. There's another text card and then a report card, and that's essentially a special request, a special kind of text card. And okay, we're at the end. So how did I build that? Well, I built configuration. One of the things that I found in that exploration phase was that I was repeatedly hacking the same kind of things into the code. So I pulled those out to make them configurable. And what kind of things did I configure? Well, the error checking that I just mentioned, it happens with a probability of about once in every 200 turns by default, although you can adjust that probability in the config. And the reason I did that was it's actually quite expensive, because as I implemented it, it runs, I don't know, 20 different checks or something. And I wasn't finding that it was returning any great value. It just wasn't going wrong very often. So I decided to do about once every 200 turns. So in that space, it's going to happen every now and again, and over lots of runs, it will cover lots of the space, but it didn't look like the most useful check. I also have a probability for do you want to add another symptom? So kind of answering the question, do you want to add another symptom? Because you can have more than one symptoms in this system. And by default, the walker will answer no about 80% of the time. And that means that on average, the assessments will get 2 or 3, sometimes 4 symptoms in them, which is roughly in line with what real users of our system give. But if I wanted to make assessments longer, I could reduce this probability and more symptoms would be added, and then there'd be more questions to ask. I also made really detailed and very parsable logs. The logs dumped the config in case I wanted to look and see what any given run had done. They also dump full payloads, and I haven't got all the payloads in here because it would make it unreadable, but you can see there's kind of JSON in there. Also the text, and this was what was scrolling up the screen as we watched the demo, and also a dump of state at the end of the assessment. And this is really useful because let's say I run 1,000 assessments, then I can begin to say, okay, in which of these assessments was a certain state seen, and I can partition the runs and then look for differences or patterns across those partitions. So that the walker generates data, and then I can explore the data. I also built a wrapper around the walker to let it run in parallel. And I built the walker in Python. It's essentially my first Python program. I was interested to learn Python, and I didn't really know how to make it run in parallel. And I wasn't that interested in making the script really dirty, but I did know how to make a bash script that could run the walker in parallel. So that's what I did. And this particular run is 5 iterations of 2 walkers in parallel. And the log files is essentially what you can see there. Again, this was really useful because when you're in parallel, you can start to do load tests and soak tests and so on. Here's an example. I was interested to know, as I said earlier on, what would long assessments look like? Would the response time from the server get longer as assessment length increased? And this is some data with response time on the vertical axis that shows that, yes, if you run for long enough, the response time about trebles. The interesting thing is it trebles to something that's still acceptable, and it takes about 17,000 dialogue turns to get there. And I made this assessment long by saying, add lots of symptoms and hit the previous button, or rather choose to go back 1 dialogue step very frequently. So it's a very unnatural assessment, but it's a legal assessment, and it's one that can be interesting to force out problems with the service. In this case, I was interested to know not only about the response time, but if we had very long assessments, might we start to see memory leaks on the server side? And the good news is we didn't see any memory leaks. And while this experiment was running, I had another set of walkers talking to the server, which were doing regular assessments. And I was interested to see if they would slow down while this was going on. And the good news is they didn't. They kind of carried on with a reasonably constant response time. So this was a really interesting experiment to do. And there's no way I could have done this manually. And it was very convenient to be able to do it with the walker that I was already using for other exploration. Here's another example of something that we got from it. Here's path through the assessment space, running a walker in parallel again for, I don't know, maybe 25 walkers in parallel. And for long periods of time, we occasionally found a 500 server error was generated. And eventually we tracked it down to a service several layers down in the stack from our own service. And it took several rounds of attempted fix before we managed to stop it happening. And the other developers on the team were using the walker to help them see whether the changes they'd made had had any effect. So let me briefly reflect on what I did. When people think about test automation, they often think of it as something like this quality checking machine on a production line. You kind of wheel your build into the unit tests and the integration tests. They ask the same questions they always did, get the same answers that they always did, hopefully, and then say, okay, this build's good. Maybe you might think, having seen what I've just described, that test automation can be more like a microscope. There's various lenses that you can apply, and you can focus them in various ways to look at the system under test. And I think that's true to an extent. But I've come to think that what I was building was more like this. kind of lab, a kind of experimental bench in a lab, and there's tons of different bits of tools, largely tools that can be configured in lots of ways, and tools that you can get into the back of and change. And as an experimentalist, when I find something, some kind of tool that looks interesting, I can put it in a box with some dials on it and keep it to use in future experiments. Adding the randomness means that I set the tools going, exploring that space. It's kind of doing work for me without me needing to be watching it. It can find things, generate data that I can explore. What worked well? Well, I've talked a lot about what worked well. I didn't mention replay. Replay, I built another wrapper around a walker that would replay the log files. And that was really helpful. But you kind of see some kind of failure. You can just run a replay and see whether it happens again, because, you know, sometimes, as everybody here knows, bugs are easy to repeat, and sometimes they aren't easy to replicate. And what was challenging, though, keeping up with the dev team, or rather the developers on the team, as they were building was difficult, and that's a perennial problem for testers. As they change the code, I'd need to keep the walker in step. Not having identifiers on the cards was a bit of a problem. Sometimes I wanted to be able to say, where am I in the dialogue? And to begin with, I was having to do that by parsing the text, which isn't very reliable. We eventually introduced card identifiers in just the same way that we have identifiers on elements in web pages to make them addressable. We wondered whether we might be able to do some kind of medical testing, not like really serious regression testing. We test the reasoning engine very strictly, but could we make quite weak assertions just to give us the kind of confidence that things weren't obviously wrong? And the way we tried to do that, and it didn't work, by the way, the way we tried to do that was say, okay, I'm going to start the assessment with a really benign symptom, like something like head lice. And I'm going to assert that at the end, we're not going to be sent to the hospital. But the thing is, with the randomness, if you run enough assessments, you will find a path through that assessment space that takes you from head lice to call for an ambulance. So we weren't very successful there. I didn't think I'd need to keep any state on the client side, and that was proved wrong, particularly if I wanted to make assertions across dialogue steps. And if you've been watching this and thinking, well, he hasn't mentioned model-based testing, this is the point where I'm going to mention it. I deliberately didn't make a model because I thought that that little flowchart that I showed would be simple enough that I wouldn't need one. In retrospect, what I actually did was encoded a great deal of knowledge about our application just into my Python script. And so I would have been, I think, better in retrospect, starting with an explicit model. When you find issues, particularly like that 500 server error one, people often say, you know, like Han Solo in Star Wars, great shot, kid, that was 1 in a million. How did you find that? And we can say, yeah, that was 1 in a million. But with the kind of tooling that I've built, I can take 1 million shots. And that's the message that I want to leave you with. This kind of tooling helps you without you even needing to be doing anything. It can work in the background, taking 1 million shots, and then you can look for the one that matters. Okay, I'd be really happy to take questions.
Thank you, James. That was really insightful. Please raise your question. Please raise your hand, or please type the question in the chat box. We'll take it. So Lisa is asking, it's a bit like generative testing. There are some other names for that which I've forgotten. Oh, this is not a question, this is a comment.
Yeah, I actually like Lisa's right. It's a bit like hypothesis, the that framework, but operating at a kind of system level instead of at a unit level.
Anybody is having any questions for James? Yeah, Larry is having questions, so please go ahead.
Yeah, hi James, thanks a lot for your presentation. So this was an experience report of quite an elaborate form of test design, and test design is always based on coming up with good ideas. How do you come up with good ideas, or do you have any specific method, or is that just happening in your brain? It's brewing and then it spits out good ideas, or how did you come up with this setup? I mean, I think you once talked to me about this, and I think it's not an easy way to test that, and somehow you came up with this idea.
Yeah, so the simple answer is I don't really know. Another answer is that by well, let me give you a piece of work I'm on at the moment. My team has just merged with another, and the other team has brought with them a new product. So one that's unfamiliar to me, and some runners around that product. And so I'm interested to get into testing that because now it's part of my team. So I've been exercising every opportunity I've had when someone's made a change to the product. I've been looking at the runners, and they produce an awful lot of data. So iteratively, I've been saying, okay, I'm going to run the runner and I'm going to start to inspect the data to see what I can learn about it. And as I do that, I find questions and that informs the next experiment. And then I have questions and that informs the next experiment. And so just this week, I've written some code that will take the output of the runner, transform it into an input, and I'm going to plug that into another product and look for consistency. And that's kind of iteratively, I'll build up an idea of what's there and what I might be able to do with it. So that's certainly one route. I think in the case of the walk that you see there was a problem, and I was trying to find ways to answer the problem. So that's probably where this one came from. I mean, I've been aware of model-based testing for a while. I hadn't had an opportunity to use it. And it turns out I didn't think I needed it, but it was probably in that kind of space of stuff that I'd read around. But in general, yeah, where do ideas come from? That's a deep one.
Next question is from Louise.
I'm curious about how you interacted with the developers around this. So did you need to get anyone's kind of permission or blessing, or were they just like, oh, James, go do your thing? And
I didn't ask. I just did it. I mean, so the majority of the people on this project were from a team, and I was joining to support the tester from that team. So I didn't ask anybody how I should test. I'm there to test, and so I tested, but this was the way that I chose to do it. I didn't neglect other testing that needed doing to do this. It wasn't like I just went away and did it. You know, I was doing the standard stuff as well, but I was trying to build this to help me with it. And initially, that kind of first walking skeleton, I would just run that after each bug fix. And so I would kind of build some confidence that the tool I was using was going to give me some value by exercising it whenever I had the opportunity.
Awesome.
So the next question is from Kratis, and he's asking for a question that you had a limited number of option A, B, C. Why did you choose randomly instead of choosing each option in a separate runs or threads?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I chose randomly because I was looking for something really simple, and I anticipated that if I ran thousands of times, I would choose all of those options, or at least I'd cover enough of the space that is similar to covering the options. If I'd tried to exhaustively cover every possible combination of all paths to a single assessment, I think that would have been computationally quite expensive. Maybe for one three-way choice, fine, but each of those leads to another choice, and each of the variants there leads to another choice. So I probably wouldn't have got that many assessments done.
The next question is from Carlos Mead, and he's asking, hey James, could you measure the coverage metrics of your workarounds?
I think that's an interesting question too. I didn't try and hook it up to any kind of coverage measuring tooling, but I think you probably could. So the service that I was going against had got integration with Honeycomb. So in principle, we could have tried to get some kind of metrics out of that. I couldn't give you any kind of coverage of the assessment space, and I'm not actually sure how I would measure that, but that's a really interesting question. But I don't have a good answer, sorry, Carla.
There's a next question by Chika. Please ask your question.
Yeah, hi James. I mean, it was a good presentation. I like to ask you, like you said, you joined the team halfway. I mean, they already kicked off this project. How long did it take you to get to understand such you could write your test? I mean, key into this whole project. How long did it take you?
It wasn't that long, actually. I'm kind of familiar with API testing and essentially API testing, so the sort of technology was all fine. Sunita, the other tester on the team, she was great. She really helped me to get to grips with what it was we were trying to build. And we actually did several sessions together where we built quite an elaborate mind map of the kind of risks that we thought were there, the kind of test ideas that we'd have. And across the course of the project, we sort of checked things off as we were doing them. And we worked together quite a lot. We paired a reasonable amount. And Sunita started using the walker as well, once it was at a state where it could be shared rather than kind of nursed through its run. She started using that too and could share knowledge about that as well.
We have a next question from Protas again, and he's asking, with the ability to rerun the logs, did you end up with a resets of runs that were useful for regression or build verification?
These questions are great. So I wasn't looking for that actually, Curtis. What the team have done is put the walker into CI. So after each build, they're going to run a few hundred assessments looking for potential side effects. If it fails after they've made a change, they can look and see, did it fail because of that change, or something else. And the developer, this is really sweet actually. I'm not a great developer, I have to say. I kind of hack stuff together. I'm more interested in the result than I am in beautiful code. But the developers on the team, they use TypeScript. They're actually remaking it in TypeScript rather than maintaining my Python. But that's great because they see the value and they can build a better one than I could. So did I find sets that were useful for regression? That wasn't the aim, but I'll tell you what I have done. When you run enough of them, you end up with a lot of results of assessments. And I've helped other people test by finding cases that end up in certain places. Someone will say, I need to get to this kind of outcome. And I can search the results of the testing that I've done for cases that end there and say, okay, these are the questions that you need to answer in this way, and you'll get to this point. And that was kind of to Hillary's question, really. That was a completely unexpected outcome. I only realized after the fact that there was this potential benefit. And in fact, I did that again today for one of the developers on the team. He wanted to know how to get a particular condition out. And because of the experiments that I was describing to Hillary, I was able to give him that data, like in 2 minutes, because I just had 1,000 assessments on disk. It's really powerful.
We have a next question again from Prathas. Since this is a highly regulated type of industry, was your tools used for proving testing?
What's proving testing?
So I mean, I don't know a lot about what the regulations are in Europe, but in US, like if you're going to have a tool, like your product that provides medical recommendations, and you have to like prove that that it's going to give correct recommendations, like it doesn't send you to the hospital for head lice, or if you're having a heart attack or something, it doesn't say, oh, just call your doctor tomorrow type of thing.
So the answer is no. I mean, informally we're testing with the tool, but for the compliance and the regulatory stuff, we have a very strict test suite that has very specific inputs and expects very specific outputs.
Anybody is having any more question for James? If no, I've shared again the link of how you can become a member of our platform. And I've also shared the links. You can check some events which are upcoming, wherein you can join. If you like to share your social handles or anything, you could share it so that you can collaborate after the session. And I love to see you all people over here. Thank you. Thanks for joining. And it was super cool session. I really thanks Louise and James for sharing the different insights which they have done. Thank you, Louise. Thank you, James. And I thanks everybody
everyone.
for joining.
Thanks for joining, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.